At the will reading, the sound that struck hardest wasn't the lawyer's voice reading my grandfather's final wishes. It was my parents laughing, actually laughing, as they slid a check worth $6.9 million across the mahogany table to my sister. Then a single dollar bill slid toward me, crisp and mocking, like a tip you'd leave for bad service. My father didn't even blink when he said, "Go earn your own, Julia." My mother smirked, almost pleased with herself, like she'd been waiting years to deliver that line. Some kids just don't measure up. And here's the thing that broke me, not one person disagreed. Not even my sister. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments. And I will give you a heart. I used to think silence was just something rooms had when people stepped out of them. You know, that natural quiet that falls over a space when conversations end and footsteps fade away. Growing up in the Hartman family, I learned that silence could sit beside you at a crowded dinner table. It could fill the space between your parents and you even while they were passing dishes directly over your hands as if you weren't there. Silence, I discovered, wasn't about absence. It was about being deliberately ignored while everyone pretended it was normal. At 8 years old, I learned how invisibility actually worked. And here's what they don't tell you in those after-school specials about family dysfunction: it wasn't that no one saw you. That would almost be easier to understand, wouldn't it? No, it was that they saw you perfectly clearly and made the active choice to pretend they didn't. That's a different kind of hurt. That's the kind that teaches you that your presence is optional in your own family story. I remember one afternoon in late fall, the same kind of cold, slanted light that would later spill across that will reading table where my life would officially be valued at $1. My mother was in the living room arranging trophies on the built-in shelves, polishing each brass plate with the sleeve of her cashmere sweater. All of them belonged to Lionel. Debate medals with her name engraved in perfect script. Piano competition awards stacked like evidence of superiority. A glass plaque with her name etched in sharp serif letters that caught the afternoon sun and threw rainbows across the wall. My own project ribbon, a blue strip I'd earned at the county science fair for a completely functional water filtration system I'd built from scratch, sat folded on the corner of a side table. No frame. No polish. No place of honor. Just sitting there like junk mail someone meant to throw away but forgot about. By the end of that evening, it wasn't there anymore. I never asked where it went. I already knew the answer would be some variation of "we needed the space," or "it must have gotten misplaced," delivered in that tone that suggested I was being dramatic for even noticing. My father always said things like "focus on real achievements, Julia," while tapping Lina's shoulder and telling her which internship she'd secure, which schools would be fighting over her, which career paths were worthy of a Hartman. He spoke to me differently, not like a daughter, more like a placeholder. The person expected to manage all the things no one else wanted to deal with. Walking the dog when everyone else was too busy. Cleaning the yard because you don't mind, do you? Returning forgotten items to stores because you're going out anyway, aren't you? My father used to pat my shoulder and say, "You're steady, Julia. That's your strength." As if steadiness was a consolation prize. As if being reliable was the participation trophy they gave you when you didn't measure up in the categories that actually mattered. But there was one person who didn't talk to me that way. My grandfather, Walter. His voice was slow and patient, like he was letting me decide whether his questions even deserved answers instead of demanding my attention like it was owed to him. He'd take me to the lake house on weekends, this beautiful, quiet place that smelled like old wood and carried the constant, gentle thrum of water lapping against the dock. That sound became the soundtrack of the only piece I knew. He kept 2 fishing rods in the shed. One was new, store-bought, with all the modern features. The other was older, hand-carved, with his initials etched into the handle. And he always, without fail, handed me the carved one. "People pay attention to the wrong things, Julia," he told me once, threading a lure onto my line. "They look at the surface, the shiny exterior, the performance. They don't look at the pull underneath, the thing that actually does the work, that actually holds everything together when there's weight on the line. Those afternoons at the lake were the only times I felt truly seen. We'd sit with our lines in the water, letting the wind shift the reflections on the surface, watching the light change as clouds moved overhead. He never asked why I was so quiet. He never pushed me to talk about school or friends or accomplishments. He already understood that sometimes silence isn't about having nothing to say, it's about finally being in a space where you don't have to perform or justify your existence. Once, he nudged his chin toward a bird perched on the railing, its feathers ruffled by the autumn breeze. Small thing, ordinary, the kind of bird people walk past without noticing. Watch long enough, he said quietly, and you notice what others miss. You see the details they're too busy to catch. That's not a weakness, Julia. That's a skill. I didn't realize it then, but he was giving me the very thing my family lacked, the ability to read between actions, to track truth in the smallest details, to see what people were actually doing instead of what they claimed to be doing. He was teaching me to be an auditor of human behavior. And in a family built on appearances and selective attention, that skill would eventually become my greatest weapon. One winter break, when Lionel won another award, I don't even remember what it was for, they all blurred together after a while, my parents threw a dinner party. The house filled with bright voices and heavy perfumes, people who air-kissed and complimented my mother's hosting skills while eating food she'd paid someone else to prepare. I stood in the hallway carrying coats to the back room, playing the role I'd been assigned without anyone actually asking if I wanted it. As I passed the dining table, arms full of wool and cashmere, I heard my mother laugh softly. That same laugh. The one I'd hear years later at the will reading. Light, dismissive, almost musical in its cruelty. Julia is fine, she told a guest who'd politely asked about me. She doesn't need much. Some children are just naturally low maintenance. That sentence stayed with me longer than any argument could have. It wasn't delivered with heat or anger. It was stated as simple fact, the way you'd mention that some plants need full sun and others do fine in shade. It was the moment I understood that in the Hartman family, needing nothing meant deserving nothing. If you didn't demand attention, if you didn't create problems, if you didn't constantly remind people of your existence, then you simply didn't register as someone worth considering. And here's the really messed up part, it wasn't cruelty. Not the intentional kind, anyway. They genuinely believed their own story about who deserved what. They'd constructed this narrative where Lionel was exceptional and I was serviceable, and they repeated it so many times that it became truth. Confirmation bias on a family scale. They looked for evidence that supported their story and ignored everything that contradicted it. My science fair ribbon? Didn't fit the narrative. My straight A's in classes Lionel struggled with? Irrelevant data. The fact that I taught myself coding and built a functioning app by age 14? Background noise. None of it counted because they'd already decided what role I played in the family structure, and contradictory evidence was just uncomfortable. So they erased it. I went back to the lake house the next morning, showing up before my grandfather had even finished his coffee. He was already at the dock, sorting through tackle boxes with the focused patience of someone who understood that some tasks shouldn't be rushed. When he saw me walking down the path, he didn't ask why I'd come early or what was wrong. He didn't make me explain the tightness in my chest or the way I'd barely slept. He just handed me the carved rod and waited until I sat beside him on the weathered planks, our feet dangling above the water. The lake was still that morning. Perfectly still. Like glass. The air was cold enough to see your breath, and the world felt honest in a way home never was. No performance required. No unspoken expectations hanging in the air like humidity. Just water and sky and the quiet understanding between two people who didn't need words to communicate that something was fundamentally wrong with the world we'd left behind. That was the day I fully understood my place in the Hartman family. Not the child who needed protection or guidance or investment. The spare. The backup. The one they kept around because it looked better to have two daughters than one, because it suggested balance and fairness, because empty seats at holidays make people ask uncomfortable questions. And that was also the day I realized I would eventually have to make a choice, stay in that role forever, accepting the crumbs and the dismissals and the casual erasure, or find a way to step outside the story they'd written for me. I just didn't know yet that my grandfather was already building that exit for me, piece by careful piece, in the locked cabinet of his study that no one else was allowed to access. I didn't know that every weekend at the lake house, every quiet conversation, every lesson about watching closely and noticing what others missed, it was all preparation. He was training me. Not for fishing. For war. The morning after the will reading, the lake house felt wrong. Too bright, like someone had turned up the contrast on everything. Too busy, with my parents moving through the rooms like surveyors assessing property value instead of mourners processing loss. They opened drawers with purpose, lifted framed photographs and turned them over to check for signatures or dates, talked in numbers and assessments as if grief were just another accounting category they needed to organize. I stood near the window overlooking the dock, watching frost melt along the railing in the early sun, trying to quiet the echo of their laughter from the day before. That sound had burrowed into my skull and set up residence. I kept hearing it on loop, that casual, dismissive laughter as $6.9 million slid toward Lyanna, followed by the soft whisper of a single dollar bill being pushed in my direction like a tip for mediocre service. Lyanna drifted into the room with a coffee mug she wasn't actually drinking from. She hovered beside me near the window, close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume, the kind my mother bought her from department stores I was never taken to. She wanted to say something meaningful, I could tell. But she couldn't risk choosing the wrong words, couldn't risk saying anything that might position her on my side of an argument my parents had already decided. It was a shock for all of us, she murmured, her eyes fixed on her own reflection in the glass instead of on me. All of us. Not you. Us. Even in her attempt at comfort, she centered herself. Even in acknowledging my pain, she made sure her own discomfort got equal billing. That's the thing about people who've been told their whole lives that they're exceptional, they genuinely cannot imagine a reality where they're not the main character of every scene. My father entered next, carrying a stack of folders from my grandfather's office like he owned them. He set them on the antique table that had been in our family for 3 generations and thumbed through pages with the casual ownership of someone convinced they deserved everything they touched. His reading glasses perched on his nose, his jaw set in that expression he used in court, focused, analytical, unmoved by emotional appeals. "We'll sort this," he said, and the "we" obviously didn't include me. His gaze skimmed past me the way you glance past a coat rack or a lamp, registered but not really seen. "Your sister will handle most of the estate responsibilities. She has the business degree. She understands these things." Translation: you're too stupid to be trusted with anything important. My mother followed behind him, sorting through envelopes, humming a tune I couldn't place. Something light, almost cheerful. When she reached the small pile that had been left specifically for me, just the dollar, the sealed letter, and a single key, she paused just long enough for the silence to thicken like humidity before a storm. Then, without looking up, without even bothering to make eye contact, she delivered the line that locked everything into place. "Go earn your own, Julia." No heat. No hesitation. Just a verdict delivered with the finality of a judge's gavel. Like she'd been waiting years to say it out loud, to finally speak the truth everyone had been dancing around at every birthday, every holiday, every family dinner where I was present but not included. Lyanna shifted her weight, visibly uncomfortable but silent. My father pretended to reread a document, his eyes not actually moving across the text. The only sound in that room was the distant creak of the dock settling into the cold water outside, that familiar sound that suddenly felt like it belonged to a different life. A life where I still believed family meant something other than a hierarchy I'd never be allowed to climb. I didn't respond. What was there to say? Arguing would have made me look pathetic. Crying would have confirmed their belief that I was weak. Fighting would have been exactly what they expected, some emotional outburst they could later reference as proof that I was unstable, irrational, not deserving of equal treatment. So I did the only thing that made sense. I stayed silent. But my hand tightened around that sealed envelope, and I felt its weight suddenly become heavier than everything they'd claimed for themselves. Heavier than $6.9 million. Heavier than the lake house or the investment portfolios or the family business they were already planning to divide. Because for the first time in my entire life, I realized something that should have been obvious years earlier. They weren't overlooking me. They weren't forgetting about me or failing to see my value. They were actively erasing me. Deliberately. Systematically. With full awareness of what they were doing. And the most devastating part? They expected me to let them. They expected me to take my single dollar, my sealed letter, and my dismissal, and quietly disappear into whatever small life they'd decided I deserved. They expected me to understand my place and stay in it. What they didn't expect, what none of them had bothered to consider, was that my grandfather had spent years teaching me to watch closely, to notice what others missed, to read the truth in details everyone else ignored. And he'd left me something they didn't know about yet. Something that would turn their carefully constructed hierarchy into rubble. I left the lake house before anyone noticed I was gone. No dramatic door slam, no tearful goodbye, no final confrontation where I told them exactly what I thought of their cruelty. Just the soft click of the latch behind me, quiet enough that it didn't interrupt my father's monologue about capital gains tax or my mother's humming. The air outside carried that thin edge of winter, sharp enough to sting your lungs, cold enough to keep you alert, the kind of weather that doesn't let you sink into numbness. I needed that. I needed something to cut through the fog of disbelief that had settled over me since watching my parents laugh while handing my sister a check that could buy a house in cash. I set the sealed envelope on the passenger seat of my car and just drove. No destination in mind at first. Just away. The trees blurred into one muted line of brown and gray, and every mile loosened the grip of their voices in my head. Go earn your own. Some kids just don't measure up. She doesn't need much. How many times had I heard variations of those sentences? How many years had I spent trying to decode them, trying to figure out what I'd done wrong, what I needed to fix, how I could finally earn the basic respect they gave Lyanna without her ever having to ask for it. And here's what I finally understood as I drove away from that lake house: I hadn't done anything wrong. That was never the problem. The problem was that they'd needed someone to be less than. They'd needed a bottom rung on the family ladder so Lyanna could stand higher. They'd needed a failure so her success looked more impressive. They'd needed me to be small so she could be exceptional. My inadequacy wasn't a bug in their system. It was a feature. I pulled into the parking lot of a small inn near the ridge, a place my grandfather and I had stopped once for hot chocolate after a long day of fishing. The owner, Rosa, was behind the desk. She was probably in her 60s, with silver hair and the kind of face that had earned its wrinkles through decades of genuine smiling. She recognized my name when I checked in, but she didn't ask questions. Didn't probe. Didn't make me explain why I was there alone or why my eyes were red or why my hands shook slightly as I signed the register. She just handed me a key and pointed to a quiet corner room. Take your time, sweetheart, she said, and it was the first kind thing anyone had said to me in days. The room was simple. Clean white walls, a bed with a quilt that looked handmade, a desk positioned near the window with a view of the mountains. A gift, really, for walls that didn't demand anything from me. No expectations. No roles to perform. No silent accusations hanging in the air like smoke. I set my notebook on the desk. I'd been carrying it since college, a leather-bound journal where I tracked thoughts, observations, patterns. My grandfather had given it to me years ago with one instruction: write down what you notice, Julia. Not what people tell you. What you actually see. I finally opened the sealed envelope. Inside was a key, old brass, heavy, the kind that opened something important. A short letter in my grandfather's distinctive handwriting, slanted and precise. A set of numbers written in pencil. And one line underneath, underlined twice: start where the truth was first bent. That's all. No instructions beyond that. No explanation of what the numbers meant or where the key fit or what truth he was referencing. Just enough to pull me into the dark corners he'd always hinted at, the places where appearances had replaced honesty in our family long before I was old enough to understand the cost. I read the letter 3 more times, tracing each loop of his careful penmanship with my finger. Then I opened my notebook and wrote the numbers down, studying them from every angle. They were too specific to be random. Too deliberate to be meaningless. I ran them through every pattern I could think of: dates, account numbers, file references, property valuations. I rearranged them, looked for sequences, checked them against significant family events I could remember. And then, slowly, the columns began to align in a way that only made sense if you knew why someone would hide certain payments and inflate others. And I did know. Because I'd watched my father work for years. I'd seen him bring paperwork home, heard him on phone calls with clients, absorbed the language of money and law through osmosis even when no one bothered to explain it to me directly. Being invisible had its advantages. People said things in front of me they'd never say if they thought I was actually listening. I powered on my laptop and began the work I knew best. This is what people never understood about me: I wasn't dramatic. I wasn't emotional. I was methodical. Quiet. Precise. I taught myself forensic accounting as a teenager because I was curious about how money moved through systems and what happened when those systems broke down. My family thought I was wasting time on irrelevant hobbies. What I was actually doing was building exactly the skill set I needed to decode my grandfather's breadcrumbs. I started checking archived documents tied to his old company. Public filings that were technically available to anyone but buried under enough legal jargon that most people wouldn't know what they were looking at. I compared notes with financial statements. I mapped the flow of payments that never quite matched the official timeline everyone referenced. When something didn't align, I color-coded it in my spreadsheet: yellow for suspicious, orange for definitely wrong, red for potentially illegal. When something repeated in a pattern, I boxed it in red and drew arrows connecting the dots. Hours passed like minutes. No fury. No tears. Just clarity. The kind of cold, sharp clarity that comes when you finally stop trying to make excuses for people and just look at what they actually did. And what I found was this: the truth wasn't hiding. It was sitting in plain view, waiting for someone who wasn't invested in the illusion to actually look at it. My grandfather's company had been profitable. Very profitable. Until about 15 years ago, when my father became his primary legal advisor. That's when things got complicated. Payments started appearing in amounts that were always just slightly below the thresholds that would trigger automatic review. Rounded numbers that looked clean on paper but didn't match the messy reality of actual business expenses. Transfers to shell entities with names that sounded legitimate but had no real operational history. By late afternoon, my notebook was half filled with timelines and patterns and documented inconsistencies. And a picture emerged that was so clear, so obvious once you actually looked, that I almost laughed at how brazen it was. My father hadn't just advised my grandfather. He'd systematically stripped him of control. Redirected funds. Created legal structures that looked like protection but were actually theft. And he'd done it slowly enough, carefully enough, that by the time anyone noticed, the damage was already done and the paperwork made it all look legitimate. My mother had been part of it too. Her signature appeared on advisory memos she'd always claimed were just routine administrative tasks. Lyanna probably didn't know. She was too busy being exceptional to notice what was happening in the background. But my parents knew exactly what they were doing. They'd built their wealth not through hard work or smart investments or any of the stories they told at dinner parties. They'd built it by stealing from a man who trusted them. From my grandfather. The man who'd loved them, supported them, given them every advantage. And when he tried to correct course, tried to protect what was left, they'd marginalized him. Made him seem old and confused. Suggested his memory was failing. Classic financial abuse, textbook perfect, executed with the kind of precision that comes from people who know exactly which lines they're crossing. I leaned back in the chair, letting the weight of it settle over me. And here's the thing, I wasn't surprised. Not even a little bit. Disappointed? Sure. Disgusted? Absolutely. But surprised? No. Because this was just the financial version of what they'd been doing to me my entire life. Taking what didn't belong to them and convincing everyone, including themselves, that they deserved it. I took out a fresh page in my notebook and drew a line down the center. On the left side, I began listing facts. Dates, amounts, account numbers, names of shell companies, signatures on documents, public records that contradicted private claims. On the right side, I listed sources, where each piece of information could be independently verified, which documents were public record, which ones I'd need to request through proper channels. No accusations. No speculation. No emotional interpretations. Just facts, arranged cleanly enough that they spoke for themselves. I didn't need to fight them. The truth could do that on its own. As the sun dipped behind the hills and the room darkened around me, I took out the second item from the envelope, the brass key. I turned it over in my hand, feeling its weight, studying the worn edges. I knew exactly which door it belonged to. The locked cabinet beneath my grandfather's desk. The one he always touched before leaving the study, that unconscious gesture people develop when they're checking on something important. A habit I'd filed away years ago without fully understanding its significance. Now I understood. I closed my notebook and slid it carefully into my bag. Then I drove back to the lake house, arriving just after twilight when the sky was that deep purple blue that makes everything look slightly unreal. Their cars were still there, positioned neatly in the driveway like chess pieces on a board. Lionel's white Mercedes. My father's black BMW. My mother's silver Lexus. All of them expensive. All of them paid for with money that should have gone to preserving my grandfather's legacy, funding his research foundation, supporting the causes he actually cared about. I moved quietly across the property, my steps absorbed by the damp wooden planks of the walkway. Inside the house, a few lights glowed in the hallway, casting long shadows. I could hear laughter drifting from the living room, thin, uneasy, forced. They were talking about investment projections, about which properties would appreciate fastest, about tax strategies for managing their windfall. Even now, hours after reading the will, still hungry. Still calculating. Still treating my grandfather's death like a business opportunity rather than a loss. I slipped into the study without being seen. The air inside was still and heavy, holding the faint scent of old books and cedar, the smell I associated with safety and honesty, and the only adult who'd ever treated me like I mattered. The desk lamp was already on. My father must have been in here earlier, rifling through papers, claiming what he thought was his. I knelt beside the desk and pulled out the brass key. The locked cabinet was exactly where I remembered, a small wooden box built into the desk frame, easy to miss if you didn't know to look for it. I fitted the key into the metal slot and turned. It clicked open with a sound that felt absolutely final. Like a door closing on one version of reality and opening onto another. Inside were binders, thin, labeled only by years. A stack of notes in my grandfather's handwriting. A small digital recording device. A few printed emails. And a single envelope addressed to me, sealed with the same red wax he'd used on the first letter. I didn't open that envelope yet. First, I needed to understand what I was looking at. I sorted through the binders methodically, page by page. And what I found confirmed everything I'd already traced. My parents' fingerprints were all over decisions that had stripped my grandfather of control in ways he'd never publicly admitted. Rounded payments that added up to millions over time. Legal memos written in my father's distinctive phrasing, always technically correct, always defensible, always structured to look like protection when they were actually theft. Notes in my mother's handwriting about advisory fees that exceeded what any legitimate consultant would charge. A pattern of advice that somehow always benefited them and cost him. I pulled up my phone and began photographing pages. I uploaded them to a secure cloud folder, then backed them up in 2 additional locations. Simple, professional, clean. The kind of evidence preservation you do when you know this is going somewhere official eventually. In the corner of the study, partially hidden behind a stack of books on the shelf, I noticed something I'd never seen before. A camera. So small it blended into the wood grain of the bookshelf, the lens barely visible unless you were specifically looking for it. My grandfather's letter had said everything I needed to understand would become clear. And suddenly it did. Truth is only effective when the right people see it. The lake house had been recording everything. Not just today. Not just yesterday. Everything. Every conversation my parents had in this study. Every document they'd reviewed. Every calculation they'd made. Every moment they thought they were alone and could speak freely about what they were really doing. This wasn't just documentation. This was a complete record of their betrayal, captured in their own words. Preserved by a man who knew exactly what he was dealing with and had been quietly building a case for years. I stood slowly, carefully, letting the realization wash over me like cold water. My grandfather hadn't just left me evidence. He'd left me a weapon. He built a system to catch them in their own lies, and he placed it in my hands because he knew I was the only one who would actually use it. This wasn't about revenge. Revenge is emotional, reactive, messy. This was about administration. About executing a plan that had been in place long before that well reading. About finishing what he'd started when he realized the people he trusted most had betrayed him in the worst possible way. I closed the cabinet, locked it again, and slipped the key into my pocket. No need to announce what I'd found. Not yet. Let them think they'd gotten away with it. Let them celebrate their inheritance and make their plans and congratulate themselves on how smoothly everything had gone. As I stepped back into the hallway, I heard my mother's voice rise from the living room, crisp and certain, the way she always sounded when she was explaining why things had worked out exactly as they should. Julia will stay out of this. She never had the mind for complex matters anyway. Some people are just naturally suited for simpler lives. I paused in the shadows, unseen. Their voices filled the house, confident in their assumptions, unaware that the walls were finally listening. That justice wasn't sleeping. That the daughter they'd dismissed as simple and steady was standing 15 feet away with documentation of every crime they'd committed. I turned away and walked back to my car, steady and silent. This time I wasn't there to be included. I wasn't there to ask for scraps or acceptance or recognition. I was there to finish what my grandfather started. And they had absolutely no idea what was coming. Morning light cut across the lake house floor in a thin, cold line when I returned 3 days later. I'd spent those 72 hours doing exactly what my grandfather had trained me to do, watching, documenting, building an airtight case from publicly available information and the materials he'd left me. No guesswork. No assumptions. Just facts, stacked so carefully that they couldn't be explained away with charm or legal maneuvering or the kind of gaslighting my family had perfected over decades. My parents were already dressed when I walked in, too formal for the hour, too composed for what they believed was still safely under their control. My father wore his courtroom suit, the navy one he used when he needed to project authority. My mother had on her pearls, the real ones, because even grief was a performance that required the right costume. Lina hovered nearby in the corner, twisting the edge of her silk sleeve, radiating the kind of discomfort that comes from knowing something is wrong but being too invested in the outcome to actually object. When the knock sounded at the front door, all three of them straightened like soldiers at attention. They thought it was a client. Or maybe another lawyer coming to help execute their plan. They were bracing for applause, for confirmation that they'd successfully navigated a tricky situation and come out ahead. What they got instead was Mr. Boone. My grandfather's oldest friend. Executor of his actual estate. The man who'd been quietly watching them for years, documenting their behavior, waiting for exactly this moment. He stepped inside without greeting anyone, carrying a leather folder and a small device that looked like a portable speaker. He was 73 years old with steel gray hair and the kind of face that had seen every con, every manipulation, every variety of human selfishness and stopped being surprised by any of it. He nodded at me first. Just a slight tilt of his head, acknowledgement passing between us. Then he looked at my parents and sister. Still no greeting. No pleasantries. No sorry for your loss or thank you for gathering. Just silence that grew heavier with each passing second. My mother's smile tightened at the edges. Mr. Boone. Is this really necessary? We've already reviewed the will. Everything was quite clear. He didn't answer. He simply placed the folder on the dining table and pressed a button on the device. The room filled with the soft click of an audio file loading. Then came my grandfather's voice. Steady. Unmistakable. Recorded in the same study where my parents had spent the past 3 days tearing through his belongings like looters at an estate sale. If this recording is being played, it means the conditions have been met. It means certain people have revealed exactly who they are when they thought no one was watching. My father shifted his weight, caught off balance for the first time in years. My mother's expression stayed rigid, but I saw her hands clench. Lionel went pale. My grandfather's voice continued, calm and measured, like he was explaining a business transaction rather than exposing a betrayal. I trusted the people closest to me to handle my affairs with integrity. Some honored that trust. Some did not. And so I left very specific instructions to ensure the truth would be seen clearly, documented thoroughly, and presented without room for debate or manipulation. A second click. The device's small screen lit up with footage, security camera video from the study. There were my parents, 3 days ago, opening drawers with surgical precision. Discarding family photographs without looking at them. Evaluating items like they were appraising inventory. Their voices carried clearly through the speakers, talking about property values, leverage points, which assets could be liquidated fastest. My mother stepped forward, her voice sharp. This is taken completely out of context. We were simply organizing. Mr. Boone raised one hand. Not aggressively. Just enough to signal that interruption wouldn't be tolerated. Let it play. Another clip appeared on the screen. This time, financial records projected in clear columns. The same anomalies I'd circled in my notebook, now displayed for everyone to see. Payments that always stopped just below reporting thresholds. Transfers to shell companies with my father's fingerprints all over the formation documents. Advisory memos with my mother's signature, authorizing fees that exceeded anything remotely reasonable. My father's initials appeared again and again, always in the margins of documents that redirected funds away from my grandfather's intended purposes. My father exhaled sharply through his nose, the sound he made when he was preparing to demolish someone's argument in court. This is old paperwork being deliberately misinterpreted. Standard estate planning structures. Completely legitimate financial instruments that any competent attorney would. The recording shifted again. My grandfather's voice returned, softer now but edged with something I'd never heard from him before. Weariness. Deep, bone-level exhaustion from carrying knowledge he'd never wanted to have. Julia, if you're hearing this, you've already seen what they hoped would never be found. The will reading was not the end. It was the beginning. Everything that comes next relies on what you choose to do with truth that was deliberately buried. My mother's composure finally cracked. A flash of genuine panic cut through her carefully maintained expression. Julia, stop this right now. You don't understand how these things work. You don't understand the complexity of, but I didn't say a word. I just stood there, watching them squirm, watching the reality of consequences finally register on faces that had never once considered they might be held accountable for anything. Mr. Boone opened the leather folder with the deliberate slowness of someone who knew the bomb he was about to detonate. He slid out a set of documents, official, notarized, signed long before my grandfather died. Prepared while he was still healthy and sharp and fully aware of exactly what he was doing. These are the actual final directives, Boone said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Your father and mother retain the properties that were assigned to them in the will you heard 3 days ago. Your sister retains her trust fund. But the remainder of the estate, including the controlling interest in your grandfather's research foundation, the lake house property, and the liquid assets totaling approximately $8.3 million, transfers to Julia alone. The room went silent. Not the comfortable silence of people processing good news. The suffocating silence of people watching their entire plan collapse in real time. My father stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood. Absolutely not. This can be contested. We have grounds to challenge based on, it can be contested, Boone interrupted, his tone unchanged. But if any challenge is filed, every single asset defaults to the Research Foundation in full. That was Walter's stipulation. Written in language that even you, counselor, cannot misinterpret or manipulate. He let that sink in for a moment before continuing. There's also a clause regarding potential legal review of past advisory work. Criminal review, specifically. Your former client, Walter Hartman, documented every instance of financial manipulation, every questionable transfer, every piece of advice that somehow always benefited you at his expense. He has recordings. He has contemporaneous notes. He has emails you thought were deleted. And he left instructions that if you contest Julia's inheritance, all of that documentation goes directly to the State Attorney General's office with a formal request for investigation. The color drained from my father's face. My mother made a small sound in the back of her throat, something between a gasp and a whimper. For the first time in my entire life, I saw my parents genuinely afraid. Not worried about appearances. Not concerned about embarrassment. Actually, physically afraid of consequences they couldn't talk their way out of. You know which work he meant, Boone said quietly, his eyes locked on my father. The shell companies. The advisory fees that were actually kickbacks. The transfers structured to avoid reporting requirements. All of it documented with the kind of thoroughness that comes from a man who spent 50 years building businesses and knew exactly what theft looked like when he saw it happening to himself. My mother found her voice, but it came out thin and desperate. He was elderly. His judgment was impaired. Any competent attorney would argue his judgment was perfect, I said. My first words since entering the room. All eyes turned to me. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew exactly what you were doing. And he knew the only way to stop it was to build a case so airtight that you'd have to choose between accepting what he left me or risking prison. I stepped forward, not to intimidate, but to be seen. Really seen. For maybe the first time in their presence, I wasn't trying to be smaller or quieter or less threatening to their narrative. Every weekend at the lake house, he was teaching me. Not fishing. Not how to be patient or observe nature. He was teaching me how to audit financials, how to spot inconsistencies, how to document patterns of behavior. He was training me to finish what he started. My father's jaw clenched. You have no idea what you're interfering with. The complexity of these estate matters, the legal implications. I have a degree in forensic accounting, I said calmly. I've spent the last 3 years working for a firm that specializes in uncovering exactly this kind of fraud. The only reason you didn't know that is because you never once asked what I actually do for a living. You just assumed I was filing paperwork somewhere, being steady and simple and forgettable. Lina spoke for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper. Julia, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know they were. You didn't want to know, I corrected. There's a difference. You had every opportunity to notice that the math didn't add up, that Grandpa was being systematically isolated from his own finances, that the people advising him were the same people benefiting from every decision he made. You didn't look because looking would have complicated your story about deserving everything you got. Boone pulled out one more document, the piece of paper I'd been waiting for. Julia, there's one more thing your grandfather wanted you to have. The deed to this property. He slid it across the table toward me. As of this morning, the lake house is yours. Fully transferred. Your parents have 72 hours to remove their personal belongings. After that, anything left becomes your property to dispose of as you see fit. My mother's face went from pale to red. You can't be serious. We have rights. You have what Walter chose to give you, Boone said, his voice like iron. Which, given what you took from him over the years, is considerably more generous than you deserve. I picked up the deed, feeling the weight of paper that represented more than property. It represented vindication. Proof that someone had seen the truth and taken steps to protect it. Proof that I wasn't crazy or dramatic or misinterpreting decades of dismissal and erasure. My grandfather had seen exactly what was happening, and he'd built an escape route for me out of that family system brick by documented brick. I placed one more item on the table. The brass key from the locked cabinet. Such a small object. Barely made a sound when it touched the wood. But my mother flinched like I'd fired a gun. That cabinet has video too, I said quietly. Every conversation you had in the study. Every document you reviewed. Every calculation you made thinking no one would ever check your math. It's all recorded. All backed up in multiple locations. All ready to be submitted as evidence if you make this harder than it needs to be. My father opened his mouth, then closed it. For once in his life, he had no argument. No legal strategy. No way to twist the facts into a shape that favored him. Boone closed his folder with a crisp snap. All that's left is acknowledgement. You can accept these terms quietly, or you can contest them and face investigation. Your choice. You have 48 hours to decide. I nodded once. Not in victory. Not in celebration. Just an acknowledgement that something was finally falling into place after being wrong for so long. My parents said nothing. Not because they agreed, but because they finally understood there was nothing left to argue. Every angle was covered. Every escape route closed. Every manipulation they'd perfected over decades suddenly useless against documentation they hadn't known existed. Behind them, through the window, the lake stretched out perfectly still. The dock didn't creak. The water didn't ripple. Even the house seemed to hold its breath. The reversal wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Truth, when it's built on facts instead of emotions, doesn't require volume. It just requires patience and the willingness to let people reveal themselves completely before you show them the mirror. As my family filed out of the lake house, silent, diminished, finally forced to confront what they'd done, I stayed behind in the study. The room my grandfather had loved. The place where he'd built his case against the people who betrayed him. Where he'd created a legacy not of money or property, but of protected truth. I sat in his chair and looked out at the lake. The same view he'd seen every weekend. The same water that had taught me to watch closely and notice what others missed. And for the first time in my entire life, the silence felt like peace. I stayed behind after everyone left, letting the lake house settle back into its natural quiet. The air inside still carried the faint smell of cedar and old paper, my grandfather's trace, untouched by the storm that had just passed through. I stood by his desk, my fingertips resting on the worn edge, the same place he used to tap when he was thinking through a problem. Now it felt like a boundary line I'd finally stepped over. Not crossed. Stepped over. Because crossing implies you're going somewhere you're not supposed to be. I was exactly where I belonged. Outside, the water barely moved. A thin layer of mist hovered above the surface, rising and fading in slow breaths like the lake itself was exhaling tension it had been holding for years. I opened the door and walked to the dock, the boards cool under my feet, the same boards I'd sat on as a child with nothing but questions about why the world worked the way it did. Back then, my grandfather would point at the quiet surface and say, "Still water tells the truth if you know how to listen." For the first time in months, I actually listened. Not to the echo of my mother's cutting remarks. Not to my father's dismissive assessments. Not to Lina's performative discomfort that always centered her own feelings even in moments that had nothing to do with her. Just the soft lap of water against wood and the steady rhythm of my own breathing. I didn't replay what had happened inside. Didn't obsessively review every word of the confrontation or wonder whether they felt guilt or shame or anything resembling remorse. Their reactions were no longer my responsibility to manage or interpret or care about. The documents had done their work. The recordings had told their story. The truth had landed exactly where it needed to, and what they chose to do with it, whether they learned anything or just resented getting caught, that was their problem now. Not mine. The sun pushed through a break in the clouds, laying a thin gold stripe across the water that stretched toward me like an invitation. I watched it shimmer and shift, and something inside my chest loosened. Not dramatically. Not like some movie moment where music swells and everything suddenly makes sense. Just a quiet release of pressure I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten it wasn't supposed to be there. The weight of trying to earn love that was never going to be freely given. The exhaustion of monitoring my own existence to make sure I wasn't taking up too much space. The constant mental calculation of whether speaking up would cost more than staying silent. All of it just lifted. I sat on the edge of the dock, letting my feet hover above the surface. The cold air touched my skin lightly, almost gently, as if the lake itself recognized the shift. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Mr. Boone, the foundation board wants to meet with you next week. Your grandfather left very specific instructions about the direction he wanted it to take. They're excited to hear your vision. My vision. Not my parents' plan. Not Lina's interpretation of what success should look like. Mine. I typed back, I'll be there. Then I turned off my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. For just a few more hours, I wanted to sit with the quiet and let it teach me what came next. Behind me, I heard a car pull up. Not my parents, they'd left an hour ago, silent and defeated in a way I'd never seen before. This was a different engine, older, familiar. I turned to see Rosa from the inn walking down the path, carrying a thermos and 2 cups. Thought you might want some company, she said, settling beside me on the dock without waiting for permission. Or at least some decent coffee. I smiled, genuine, unrehearsed, the kind of smile that comes from actual warmth instead of social obligation. How did you know I was here? Small town. Word travels. She poured coffee into both cups and handed me one. Also, your grandfather told me years ago that if anything ever happened to him, I should check on you. Said you'd probably need a reminder that not everyone in your life was going to disappoint you. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking coffee and watching the light change on the water. Finally, Rosa spoke again. You know what the hardest part is going to be? What? Believing you deserve this. Not the money or the property. Those are just things. I mean believing you deserve to take up space in your own life. To have opinions that matter. To make decisions without apologizing for them. She looked at me directly. Your family spent decades teaching you to be small. That training doesn't disappear overnight just because you won a legal battle. She was right. I could feel it already, the instinct to minimize what had happened, to make excuses for my parents' behavior, to wonder if maybe I'd been too harsh or if there was some explanation I was missing. Decades of conditioning don't evaporate just because you finally stood up for yourself once. How do you unlearn that? I asked. Rosa shrugged. Same way you learn anything else. Practice. You make decisions and you don't apologize for them. You set boundaries and you don't feel guilty about maintaining them. You build a life that reflects who you actually are instead of who someone else needed you to be. And you do it over and over until it starts to feel normal instead of rebellious. She finished her coffee and stood, brushing off her jeans. Your grandfather saw something in you they never did. Not because you're special or chosen or any of that fairy tale nonsense. but because you were willing to look at ugly truths and not flinch. That's rare. Don't waste it trying to make peace with people who only valued you when you were useful. After she left, I sat alone on the dock for another hour. The sun continued its arc across the sky. The mist burned off. The water went from gray to blue to gold as afternoon shifted toward evening. And I made a decision. Not an emotional one. Not a vengeful one. Just a practical choice about how I wanted to move forward. I pulled up my phone and opened the folder where I'd stored all the financial documentation. Every shell company. Every suspicious transfer. Every piece of evidence that my parents had systematically stolen from my grandfather while pretending to protect him. And I sent it to the state attorney general's office with a formal complaint. Not because I wanted to destroy them. Not because I was angry, though I had every right to be. But because theft is theft, and being related to the people who robbed you doesn't make it less criminal. Because letting them walk away with no consequences would teach them nothing except that they could keep doing it to the next vulnerable person they gained power over. Because justice isn't about revenge. It's about restoration. It's about saying this was wrong and making sure wrong things have a cost. My grandfather had left me the documentation. He'd built the case. But he'd left the final decision to me, whether to use it or let it gather dust in a locked cabinet. I chose to use it. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. My mother. I stared at her name on the screen, my finger hovering over the decline button. Then I answered. Not because I owed her a conversation, but because I wanted to hear what she'd say now that everything had changed. Julia. Her voice was tight, controlled, vibrating with barely suppressed panic. What have you done? I filed a complaint, I said calmly. With documentation. The Attorney General's office will review it and decide whether to pursue charges. That's how the system works. You're going to destroy this family over money? Over your petty resentment about, this isn't about resentment, I interrupted. This is about the fact that you and Dad committed fraud. You stole from someone who trusted you. And I have proof. What happens next isn't up to me. It's up to the legal system you both claim to respect so much. Silence on the other end. Then, your father could go to prison. Yes, I said. He could. That's typically what happens when you commit financial crimes. Even if you're wearing an expensive suit while you do it. Julia, please. Her voice cracked. I know we haven't always. I know things weren't fair to you growing up. But this is too far. This is vindictive. And there it was. The same pattern she always used. Minimize the harm she caused, maximize the harm of any response to it. Make herself the victim of my overreaction instead of acknowledging what she'd actually done. You handed me $1 at a will reading and told me to go earn my own, I said quietly. You laughed while you did it. You spent my entire childhood making me feel like I didn't matter, like I was an inconvenience you tolerated because empty chairs at holidays look bad. And when I finally have proof that you weren't just emotionally cruel but actually criminal, you want me to protect you because family is supposed to cover for family. Is that about right? That's not, you're twisting, I'm not twisting anything. I'm just refusing to pretend anymore. I took a breath. If you want mercy, Mom, try offering some accountability first. Admit what you did. Apologize. Return what you stole. Show some actual remorse for betraying someone who loved you. Then maybe we can talk about what happens next. I can't do that, she said. If I admit the legal implications, then I guess you've made your choice. I hung up before she could respond. And I didn't feel guilty. Didn't feel cruel. Didn't feel anything except clear. For the first time in my life, I'd set a boundary and held it, even when someone tried to make me feel bad for having needs they didn't want to meet. Even when the person was my mother. even when she used words like family and forgiveness as weapons to protect herself from consequences. Over the next few weeks, things happened quickly. The Attorney General's office opened a formal investigation. My parents hired expensive lawyers who filed motions to dismiss, claiming the evidence was inadmissible or taken out of context. But Mr. Boone had made sure everything was documented properly, obtained legally, preserved correctly. There were no procedural mistakes to exploit. No technicalities to hide behind. Just facts, stacked in neat columns, telling a story that couldn't be argued away. Lyanna called me once. They're saying Dad might be charged with multiple felonies. Mom could be charged as an accomplice. Julia, they could lose everything. They already took everything, I said. From Grandpa. From me. They just didn't expect anyone to notice or care enough to do anything about it. But they're our parents. And that means they should have known better. Not that they deserve protection from consequences. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, I'm sorry. For not seeing it. For not standing up for you. For taking everything they gave me and never questioning whether it was fair. It was the first real apology I'd ever gotten from her. Not performative. Not strategic. Just genuine acknowledgement that she'd benefited from a system that hurt me and had never once questioned whether she deserved her position at the top. Thank you, I said. That actually means something. What happens now? She asked. Now I build something that actually matters. Grandpa left me the foundation. I'm going to run it the way he wanted, funding research, supporting education, helping people who don't have access to opportunities. I'm going to do the work he believed in instead of the work that just generates profit. Can I help? The question surprised me. Why would you want to? Because I'm tired of being the trophy daughter, she said quietly. I'm tired of being valued for achievements that were handed to me on a foundation of lies. I want to do something real. Even if it means starting over. I thought about it. Considered whether this was another manipulation, another way for my family to worm back into my life and slowly erode the boundaries I'd built. But then I remembered what Rosa had said, not everyone in your life is going to disappoint you. Sometimes people grow. Sometimes they wake up and realize they've been playing a rigged game and they don't want to play anymore. Okay, I said. But you start at the bottom. No special treatment. No fast track. You work like everyone else, and you earn your position based on what you actually contribute. Deal? Deal. 6 months later, I stood in the conference room of the newly restructured Hartman Foundation, looking out at a team of researchers, educators, and activists who were doing genuinely important work in the world. Lyanna sat at the far end of the table, taking notes, contributing ideas, working harder than she'd ever worked for anything our parents had handed her. My father had been charged with fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. He'd taken a plea deal to avoid trial, 5 years in a minimum security facility, restitution payments, permanent disbarment from practicing law. My mother had been charged as an accomplice but received probation in exchange for testimony. Their social circle had evaporated overnight. Their carefully constructed reputation demolished by the same legal system they'd spent decades manipulating. I didn't feel victorious about any of it. Just settled. Like a ledger that had finally balanced after years of showing the wrong totals. Mr. Boone approached me after the meeting. Your grandfather would be proud. This is exactly what he envisioned. I wish he could see it, I said. He does, Boone replied, tapping the side of his head. Every time you make a decision based on integrity instead of profit, every time you choose truth over convenience, he sees it. That's how legacy actually works. That evening, I drove back to the lake house. It was mine now, fully, legally, without qualification. I'd kept most of my grandfather's furniture, his books, his fishing rods. The carved one with his initials still hung in the shed, waiting. I poured myself a glass of wine and walked out to the dock as the sun began to set. The water reflected the sky in shades of orange and pink and deep purple, and somewhere in the distance, a bird called out, lonely but not sad, just marking its territory, announcing its presence. I thought about the girl I'd been at that while reading 6 months ago. Silent, dismissed, handed a single dollar like a tip for service that was never quite good enough. I thought about how small I'd felt in that moment, how thoroughly erased. And then I thought about who I'd become since then. Not because of anger or revenge or some dramatic transformation, but because I'd finally stopped making excuses for people who'd never once made room for me. Because I'd chosen truth over comfort, consequences over complicity, my own judgment over their narrative. The quiet didn't feel empty anymore. It felt earned. I sat on the edge of the dock, letting my feet hover above the surface just like I had as a child, and I felt something I'd never experienced in my entire life. Not happiness exactly. Not triumph. Something quieter and deeper. Belonging. I belonged here. In this space. In this life. In my own skin. Not because I'd won some battle or proven them wrong or earned my right to exist through achievement, but because I'd finally stopped asking for permission to take up space in the world. So let me ask you something, because I genuinely want to know. Have you ever been in a room where people looked right through you? Have you ever been part of a family that had a clear hierarchy and you were always at the bottom? Have you ever watched someone get everything, love, money, attention, opportunity, while you got handed $1 and told to earn your own? Comment below and tell me your story. Because here's what I learned through all of this, and here's what I need you to understand if you're living through something similar right now. Family isn't about biology. It's not about last names or shared genetics or showing up to holidays out of obligation. Family is about who sees you. Really sees you. Who values you without needing you to perform or shrink or apologize for existing. And if the people you share blood with can't do that, then they're not your family. They're just people you happen to be related to. There's a difference. A big one. My grandfather showed me what real family looks like. It looks like someone noticing when you're being erased and building an escape route. It looks like documentation and protection and strategy deployed on behalf of someone who can't fight for themselves yet. It looks like fishing rods and quiet afternoons and teaching someone to watch closely and notice what others miss. That's love. The other stuff, the favoritism, the dismissal, the financial manipulation disguised as family loyalty, that's not love. That's control. And you don't owe loyalty to people who only valued you when you were useful. You don't owe silence to people who used your silence as permission to keep hurting you. You don't owe forgiveness to people who never once asked for it or showed they understood why it might be needed. Now, I'm not saying blow up your family at the first sign of conflict. I'm not suggesting you file legal complaints because your parents were sometimes unfair. But if you're living in a system where you're constantly diminished, constantly dismissed, constantly told that your needs and feelings and perceptions don't matter, trust yourself. You're not crazy. You're not too sensitive. You're not overreacting. You're just finally seeing clearly what's been happening in soft focus your whole life. And here's the thing about standing up to family systems that rely on your compliance, it's terrifying at first. Every instinct you have will tell you to back down, apologize, make peace, smooth things over. Because that's what you've been trained to do. That's how you survived. But survival isn't the same as living. And at some point, you have to choose whether you want to survive in a system that diminishes you or live in a reality where you actually matter. I chose living. It cost me relationships I'd spent decades trying to maintain. It cost me the fantasy of ever having the parents I deserved. It cost me the comfortable lie that if I just tried harder or stayed quieter or earned more, they'd eventually see my value. But what I gained was worth infinitely more than what I lost. I gained myself. My judgment. My voice. My right to take up space without apologizing for it. I gained the knowledge that I could trust my own perceptions even when everyone around me was gaslighting me into doubting them. I gained freedom. Real freedom. The kind that comes from finally putting down weight you were never supposed to carry in the first place. So if you're watching this and you see yourself in my story, if you're the forgotten kid, the scapegoat, the one who got handed scraps while someone else got the feast, listen to me very carefully. You are not the problem. You never were. The people who should have protected you failed. That's on them. Not you. And you have every right to stop pretending it's normal. Every right to set boundaries. Every right to demand accountability. Every right to walk away from people who refuse to see you as fully human. Will they call you ungrateful? Probably. Will they accuse you of tearing the family apart? Almost certainly. Will they tell stories about how you're vindictive or selfish or mentally unstable? Yeah. They will. And none of that matters. Because people who are losing control always lash out at the person who's refusing to be controlled anymore. That's not evidence that you're wrong. It's evidence that you're finally right. 3 years after that while reading, I got a letter from my father. He was 2 years into his sentence, and I guess prison gives you time to think about the choices that landed you there. The letter was short. No excuses. No justifications. Just this: I'm sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect anything from you anymore. I just needed you to know that you were right about everything. And I'm sorry it took losing everything for me to see it. I read it once, then put it in a drawer. Maybe someday I'll respond. Maybe I won't. The point is, it's my choice now. My timeline. My terms. And that's how it should be. So here's my final question for you, and I really want you to think about this one. If the people in your life suddenly had no power over you, no financial control, no emotional leverage, no ability to punish you for disobedience, would you still choose to have them in your life? If the answer is no, or even if the answer is I'm not sure, then you already know what you need to do. You're just scared to do it. And I get that. Change is terrifying. Especially when it means dismantling the only family structure you've ever known. But I promise you this, the fear of change is nothing compared to the slow death of staying in systems that require you to be smaller than you are. Nothing compared to the exhaustion of performing for people who will never applaud. Nothing compared to the grief of reaching the end of your life and realizing you spent it trying to earn love from people who were never going to freely give it. You deserve better. Not someday. Not when you're successful enough or healed enough or perfect enough. Right now. Exactly as you are. Flawed, tired, still figuring it out, you deserve people who see you and choose you and value you without needing you to audition for the role. My grandfather gave me that. And in doing so, he taught me to give it to myself. That's the real inheritance. Not the money or the property or the foundation. The knowledge that I was worth protecting. Worth fighting for. Worth leaving behind a detailed plan to ensure I wouldn't be erased. So drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if this resonated. Tell me your story if you feel brave enough to share it. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, someone who's been playing small in a family that treats them like they're optional, send this to them. Because the most radical thing you can do in a system that profits from your silence is to start speaking your truth out loud. Thanks for staying until the end. More stories are coming. More truths that need to be told. More proof that you're not alone in this, even when it feels like you are. The quiet doesn't have to be empty. Sometimes it's just making room for your voice. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.